Morning. That just brought back horrible memories when he said making his second appearance at IrisCon, because I remember the first one. It was difficult, mostly because of Brian Honan, who I'm sure many of you know. I was scheduled on that event to speak at a similar time of day, and I showed up. I was here, but I found myself completely unable to speak due to the volume of the hangover that I was suffering from at the time. And Jenny Radcliffe graciously swapped spots with me, and I managed to get my talk done in the afternoon. I've learned my lesson. I'm here on stage, hangover-free. The only way I achieved that was by making sure I didn't land until 11 p.m. yesterday. But that's forward planning. So this is going to be difficult. I'm not used to holding a mic. Get my hair out of my face and you can't hear me. There you go. So yeah, I want to spend just a brief amount of time talking to you about attacks on operational technology, critical national infrastructure, what kind of attacks are taking place, what the challenges are, and who the threat actors are, and a little bit about what the future holds in that regard. And it is completely accidental that it follows on so well from Victor's talk, but he really set it up perfectly. So let's dive into that. Why is OT security important right now? Single most important factor is convergence. So organizations, and this was definitely, I know it's a hackneyed thing or a cliche thing, but it was absolutely accelerated by lockdown, because people had to find creative and inventive ways to be able to continue maintenance of operational technology and OT infrastructure during the time when none of us were leaving homes. So this was happening anyway, that these infrastructures, IT and OT, were being brought together, but it was absolutely accelerated by lockdown. But according to Gartner, so take that as you will, by 2025, 70% of what they class as asset-intensive organizations, they expect that at least the security function will be converged across both IT and OT. That means that more than the security function is converged across IT and OT. As all of you know, I'm sure, security, unfortunately, very often follows use cases rather than drives them. So security is converging because connectivity is converging, because networks are converging, because threats are converging. The problem is that OT isn't IT. And there are several very important issues when it comes to securing OT infrastructure. The first, and I think most important, being that it's complex. It's complex, and at the same time, as the last point illustrates, as well as it being complex, the people on your security team and your infrastructure team and your network team don't have the familiarity or the experience or the exposure to OT devices, OT networks, OT best practices, OT infrastructure. Even the standard model for building an OT network is very different to the standard model for building an IT network. So not having that familiarity or the capability means that that complex infrastructure becomes almost unapproachable in the short term. The number of endpoints that are being connected in an OT environment is growing steadily and rapidly. And what we have found through our research at Forescout is that actually a large number of OT devices suffer from what we've called insecurity by design. It's not just that the way that they're deployed or the architectures they're deployed into are less secure. It's that the devices themselves suffer from insecurity by design. So all the things that you thought you'd never see again or hoped you'd never see again, like hard-coded passwords, like weak encryption ciphers, all of that stuff is hugely prevalent by design in even modern OT devices. Bear in mind, another point that's not on that slide is that many of the devices that we're trying to secure right now were not even designed to be connected in the first place. And adding to the complexity, it's not all TCP/IP. I'm looking around the room and I can see that many of you here will remember when not everything was TCP/IP, when we used to have a choice on the networks. In fact, I remember when you had to install extra software to have TCP/IP on your Windows machine, right? It didn't come as standard. We had IPX, SPX, and we had Token Ring, and we had EtherTalk, and we had a whole selection of different networking cables, let alone networking protocols. In fact, I discovered, this is totally unrelated to my presentation, but I discovered something that I had completely forgotten recently when I was wiring up stuff at home. And I was, why is the performance of this device so bad? Because Cat5 is not Cat5e. How many of you remember your different cable speeds and feeds that used to be like, cling, cling, I know all this stuff, no problem, 10 base 2, 10 base 5, 10 base T, and the different Cat5, Cat5e, Cat6. Had to look at the cable and go, oh yeah, I remember, this is from the dark ages. That's where you end up back with OT. You have serial connections, you have protocols that you've never seen before in your life. It means that a lot of your standard security solutions simply don't fit in an OT environment. And in fact, if you were to take an IT intrusion prevention system, for example, and drop it on an OT network, it would go, everything's fine here, don't worry. Nothing bad is happening here, because it doesn't understand a single thing that it's seeing. It's not parsing those protocols. So this complexity and lack of familiarity actually has very serious consequences. The number of vulnerabilities, of course, is increasing year on year. That's no surprise. The number of vulnerabilities everywhere is increasing year on year. There are very good and positive reasons for that. Bug bounty programs work, for example. The way that many bug bounty programs are structured is that they will offer incentives to researchers, higher rewards for the kinds of vulnerabilities that program is more interested in receiving, and OT has been incentivized in that way recently. So we're definitely seeing an increase in vulnerabilities, but it means also that there is an increased focus from threat actors as well, because obviously once the vulnerabilities are published, threat actors will go looking for them in order to be able to exploit them, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Security teams are rarely integrated at the moment, and actually there's a real challenge when it comes to that integration, because there's a lot of bad feeling, unfortunately, between IT people and OT people. There's not a lot of trust, and there is a lot of bad feeling. OT people firmly believe that IT people do not understand what they do, and they have completely different priorities. They love to laugh at the CIA triad, for example, or the AIC triad, and laugh about how that doesn't apply to OT, and you don't understand us. I myself have had comments directed at me on LinkedIn. Is when's the last time you wore a hard hat? Get out of here. Don't talk to us. You know nothing. This is really, really common, and it's really, really unhelpful. Visibility in an OT environment is tough. Like I said, there's no parsing of protocols. There's a very limited deployment of hardware to give you that visibility. And even if you can see the devices, it's very difficult to understand what firmware is running on that device, what patches are available, what vulnerabilities are present. All the things that you're used to seeing in your IT environment is very complex in an OT one. And another really important component, I mentioned insecure by design, but supply chain weakness plays a big role in OT as well. One of the things that we found is that, for example, TCP/IP stacks are shared across multiple manufacturers. So when you find a vulnerability in an IP stack, it's not just going to affect that single device that you were researching or that single manufacturer you were researching. You then have to go find, well, how many other manufacturers are actually using the same stack in their device and are all affected by this same vulnerability. So digital software supply chain is a real risk within OT. So I was thinking, when we talk about who is attacking your OT and why, I was wondering how many malware have actually been written specifically to target OT? And, I was at Trend Micro for 15 years, and we used to talk about malware in really big numbers. Millions, billions. Unique samples detected, and malware families detected, and new ransomware families detected. So I was like, okay, how many have actually targeted OT, specifically written for OT? And it's, what have we got here? 5, so it's 8 ever. There have been 8 malware ever so far that specifically target OT devices. Of course, it all started with Stuxnet. I know that's kind of like a swear word now in presentations, but in this context, I have to mention it. It was the first to actually target specifically OT and cause real cyber physical damage. Who was behind it? Well, it's like a supra threat actor. I don't think it's still been officially claimed, but it's certainly evidence points to and has been given the wink by Israel and the US. And it was obviously designed to retard Iran's progress in nuclear enrichment. That's an outlier. You'll begin to see a trend in everything else, and it very much follows on from Victor's presentation. The next one to emerge was Havex, and Havex was really designed for reconnaissance. It wasn't really doing much, but it had modules designed specifically to parse OT-related protocols, and it was there to gather information, to do reconnaissance work across networks, and ended up being attributed to Energetic Bear, which is the FSB, one of the threat actors that Victor mentioned in response to one of the questions. So that was really the first clue that Russia is involved here, is doing something here, and that was all the way back in 2013 with Havex. Then there was a really interesting incident in 2014 that is unattributed, didn't involve malware, but I wanted to put it on my list here because it kind of sets the stage for where we are today as well as the malware aspect, in that there was a steel mill in Germany that was attacked from external to the point where the steel mill operator was unable to safely bring down one of their furnaces. They were unable to shut it down in a safe manner. And the outcome was that furnace melted to the ground. It was a very serious kinetic damage to a steel mill. Still unattributed, wasn't malware, but was an external attack misusing the OT technology, the HMIs, the PLCs, to make changes in that operating environment that led to real kinetic damage. A real outlier in 2014, but you'll see that that's not the case anymore. And then the attacks on Ukraine began. So Black Energy 3 and Indestroyer were the 2014 and 16 attacks on Ukraine's electricity supply network. The first one in 2014 was less complex, less integrated than Indestroyer, but as a proof of concept, it was extremely successful. They managed to shut down power to a significant proportion of the population around Kyiv. And then with Indestroyer, things got even more complex. They were doing things like overwriting firmware so that once electricity had been shut off, the firmware of the hardware in question was burnt out. So in order to switch it back on, you actually had to physically drive to that location and flip physical switches rather than be able to recover digitally. So you could see that Russia were building their capabilities, and both of these are now attributed to, of course, Sandworm. And if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend Sandworm as an examination of all of these phenomena. And it was also deployed, I think, for the first time in an OT scenario, wiper software like Killdisk to try and remove forensic artifacts. And then the story continued. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has been ongoing since 2014, and so has OT-targeted cyber activity. The next one was an attack called Triton or Trisis, which took things a step further. It was less of a big bang, less of an impact than the electrical grid attacks. But what was extremely worrying about it is that it was attacking safety instrumented systems, SIS. So in an OT environment, you have the hardware that is doing the work on the factory floor, let's say. And behind that, you have safety instrumented systems that are designed to keep an eye on what's happening on the factory floor. And if it looks like something is going dangerously wrong, the safety instrumented systems are there to step in and bring things safely down to avoid disaster. Triton was malware that was specifically targeted at those safety instrumented systems. So in order to be able to take those offline so that when you attack the actual hardware on the factory floor, you can have the effect that you wanted to have. ECANS was interesting. It's the only example I can find of malware that looks to be cyber criminal, financial cybercrime motivated so far that was attacking OT. ECANS, Snake backwards, was ransomware. But what was really interesting about it is that in its kill list of processes, it included processes that were absolutely specific only to OT environments. So it was very much, as well as crypto ransomware, encrypting data wherever, it was also planning on encrypting data on OT related systems as well. The only example I found so far of that. And then again, the next three, Indestroyer 2, InController, and Cosmic Energy, all attributed to Russia as well. All as a part of the conflict in Ukraine. and all with very similar aims. And actually, something I was reading earlier this week, which kind of continues this timeline into this year, is a threat brief report from Mandiant, which is some interesting new tactics from threat actors around operational technology, in that rather than building and deploying malware specifically written for these environments, because that's quite an endeavor, right? And it requires quite a skill set and familiarity with these environments. They're now, in the same way that you've seen traditional cybercrime do, evolving into living off the land, using legitimate OT environment tools to carry out nefarious actions within those environments. So if you haven't read that threat brief from Mandiant, that's really good reading. Again, in Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, of course, the conflict has had very serious ramifications on the threat landscape in general. We've seen massive deployment of wipers. Of course, we saw, ever since the full-scale invasion, large-scale phishing attacks, trying to gain credentials for systems. We've seen very widespread DDoS attacks. We saw the OT-related attack right at the beginning of the invasion on KSAT, on the satellite ground stations, to disrupt communications. There was a lot of collateral damage as well there. I know, obviously, it affected Ukraine's ability to communicate, but it was even, for example, a wind farm in Germany that was taken offline because they were using the same infrastructure. We've seen some really innovative and interesting stuff. The Cyber Partisans group in Belarus, for example, took a piece of ransomware and they didn't exactly defang it, but they didn't want to use it to make money, and they deployed the ransomware against the rail system of Belarus and encrypted the servers on the rail network so that Russia couldn't move troops and material through Belarus to the front line for a period of time. So there's a whole load of activist groups that are coming to the fore as a part of this conflict. Some of them supporting Ukraine and acting on behalf of Ukraine, some of them officially sanctioned even, like the IT Army of Ukraine, and some of them not officially sanctioned, like One Fist. And also, unfortunately, there are hacktivists supporting the Russian cause as well. Probably more numerous than the ones supporting the Ukrainian cause, if I'm honest, in terms of raw number of different threat actors. So the consequences of war are really serious. They're really ongoing. And it's some of the things that you would expect to see, right? Standard, like the one on your right, is standard web defacement attack. That's a cinema ticket portal in Russia selling tickets to go see movies. And you can see that the thumbnail for every individual movie has been changed. Putin is a war criminal. Russia is a terrorist state. Putin in his clown makeup. I mean, it's a standard defacement attack. It's successful in its own way. But what's probably more concerning is the stuff on the other side of the screen. And these are hacktivist groups recruiting online for people to take part in hacktivist operations. But these are not the kind of op PayPal or op MasterCard, anonymous lulsec type ops that we've seen in the past. These are very specific, very targeted operations, and in many cases, they are targeted against OT and critical infrastructure. You can see some of the examples of stuff there. What that means is that we've reached the stage now where fingers on a keyboard at one end can result in this kind of activity or outcome at the other end. So these are tweets, one from GhostSec, and one from One Fist, I think the other one, of successful attacks, hacktivist attacks online against facilities in Russia that result in fire and explosion. This is the threat landscape that we live in now. So the one on your left is electricity substation that was attacked and explosion and fire. The other one is a vehicle repair facility that was attacked, explosion, fire. What's really concerning, I mean, this is, don't get me wrong, these are attacks on Russia. This is great. I'm fully in favor of this. I don't equivocate about that. But what concerns me is that once this war is over, once Ukraine emerges victorious from this war, these skills and these hacktivists and these threat actors are not going anywhere. This is the world that we live in now. These skills will be turned in other directions against other targets in the future. They will be shared in threat actor groups online. This is the world that you need to be preparing for right now, because it's the world you live in. We do a lot of research at Fourscout, and absolutely we see that hacktivists are targeting OT. We set up a bunch of honeypots online with we've got a new research paper coming out very shortly as well, which I can't preview, but it's very interesting. Keep an eye on that. Hundreds, or more than 100, close to 200 threat actor groups since the beginning of the invasion. They are targeting mostly DDoS, mostly phishing, mostly DDoS, but they are actively targeting operational technology. And with the emerging and ongoing situation in Israel and Gaza, we're seeing similar activities there. In fact, the attack on Israel by Hamas was preceded by cyber activity, and there is definitely cyber activity as a component, as Victor was saying, of everyday warfare now, and it's massively growing in importance. It's relatively easy to use online tools to discover exposed infrastructure. Finding targets is not difficult. Exploiting them, slightly more so, unless it's going to be a DDoS, in which case it's pretty simple. But like I said, these skills are now out there and they're growing. We see, when we scan the internet for exposed devices specifically within OT, we see a huge variety of different devices from different manufacturers in different industries and different geographies, but they're out there, they're exposed, they're vulnerable, and they will be targeted. Russia isn't only interested in Ukraine right now. Of course, it's overwhelmingly interested in Ukraine, but you just have to look at the public statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from people like Lavrov. Their aims and their goals remain global. Of course, there's a focus on the war in Ukraine right now, but their aims and their goals remain global. We all remain targets. In fact, there's a whole presentation I've been doing recently about disinformation and how that's Russian-driven. Here's a challenge for you related to that. Go back through your social network of choice, looking at the people in the room. It's probably Facebook. You're all old, like me. Go way back through your timeline and start looking at things that you maybe shared about 10 years ago or so. Because I did it, and I found one it's still funny, even when I think about it, it's funny. But it was Sarkozy and Merkel as Laurel and Hardy. It's actually a really funny image. But then I looked at it and I thought, but who wanted me to share that? What was the motivation behind that? Why is that image out there? These are the very subtle psyops that have been ongoing for more than a decade, and they're increasing, and AI is massively accelerating that. But that's a whole secondary presentation. But it just shows that the aims of adversarial nations are not restricted purely to the current and ongoing conflicts. And we make ourselves far too available in an OT space. The honeypots that we put out there definitely show that OT is a constant target. Attackers are probing, logging in, making changes, carrying out activities that are specific to protocols, specific to vulnerabilities. There is expertise out there. It's not just, oh, here's an interface, I'm going to log in and click around and see what I can find. People are actively trying to exploit vulnerabilities that are present in environments. And the scans that we're seeing include protocols that are specific to OT environments. So this is not just opportunistic. It's highly targeted. The reality today, unfortunately, and this is the case not just in OT, this is the reality in a SOC today, but this is going to be massively amplified and magnified when it comes to this integration of IT and OT that's rushing at us headlong. This is the reality in a SOC today. So I looked at a report recently by Palo Alto Networks. Hi, if you're in the room. And they said, they'd surveyed a whole bunch of people, and they said on average, SOCs are dealing with about 11,000 alerts in every 24-hour period. And keeping track, I think it was of about 7 different threat intelligence feeds at the same time. So 11,000 alerts. Let's say that each alert takes about 30 minutes to do the initial triage, right? Is it real? Is it a duplicate? Is it marked as critical when it should be informational? Doing that whole triage process on that alert. 30 minutes of work for 11,000 alerts is 5,500 hours of work to do in every 24-hour period. So if you're a visual person, this will help you understand that challenge a bit more. This is a stadium that holds about 10,000 people. So what you're asking your SOC team to do, which is probably not as numerous as the people on the tennis court right there, you're asking them to positively identify every individual in that crowd, make sure that they're all sitting in the right seat and that they all have a valid ticket, that they didn't bring anything in with them that they're not supposed to bring in, and that none of them swap seats while your back was turned every 24 hours. And every 24 hours, it's a new and different crowd. So to do that effectively, and remember, this is just the triage, you'd need a SOC team of 687 people, because that's 3 8-hour shifts, to do that 5,500 hours of work in a 24-hour period. That's the challenge we face right now in an IT environment. Imagine the alert volume that you're going to begin seeing when you start integrating OT into that as well. So you hear a lot of people saying, hey, data is the new oil. It's kind of like, yeah, but what does that mean? Data is the new oil. Good. Can I burn it? No. Will it drive my car? No. So what am I going to do? If data is the new oil, then algorithms are the new refineries. Because oil is pretty useless when it comes out of the ground. It's really good at making you dirty, and that's about it. It takes a refinery to turn it into something worthwhile, something that has value. And that's what our algorithms are doing with data now. This is where the power of AI is going to make, or machine learning in particular, is going to make a big difference in cybersecurity. And here's something for you. You need to stop just asking your vendors, what are you doing with machine learning? How are you going to make my life easier with machine learning? And you need to start asking yourselves what you can do with machine learning and how you can hire the right people and how you can benefit from it within your security organization internally. Because if data is the new oil, the algorithms are the new refineries. So it's a really depressing presentation. Mine often are, because it's difficult to talk about threats without being miserable. So I apologize. So I wanted to leave you with something positive, something to go away with and think, okay, how can we apply that going forwards? So I came up with 5 principles for effective OT security. The first and absolutely most important is visibility. You can't secure what you can't see. You have to understand exactly what is on your network and exactly the risk level of what is on your network and exactly the criticality of each of those devices on your network and exactly your risk tolerance for each of those devices on your network. It's not just understanding what's there. It's what does it mean to you? What does it mean to your business? And how much risk are you prepared to tolerate? Because only then can you begin to make sensible decisions about the security you're going to deploy. Any risk assessment that you do must be dynamic, must be continuous, must be ongoing. You need to know when something falls out of compliance. You need to know when something falls out of baseline. You need to know when something begins acting weirdly and suspiciously so that you can do something about it. You need to minimize your attack surface and make sure that the environment that you build, and I know this is difficult because I know we all live in legacy environments and it's unavoidable, but start to look at your environment as a whole and make sure that it is defensible. Too many flat networks are still out there. Most of your networks are probably flat. Most people don't segment networks effectively. Even if they're segmented, they're not segmented effectively. So understand your environment, make sure it's a defensible environment, examine traffic flows within your environment. Which endpoint is talking to which endpoint, and is that something that you want to allow? And change the architecture accordingly. And overall, manage, automate, monitor, respond, and archive. Archive is the one that I think gets forgotten more than anything. When the shit hits the fan, you need a time machine. You need to be able to go back and say, okay, I have this device with this risk profile. How many other devices fit that risk profile? Because this one has been hit. And if this one has been hit, they're probably going to be hit too. You need to be able to do that risk analysis. You need to be able to find patient zero. You need to be able to stop this stuff from happening again. Because even outside of the world of OT, we're already seeing double tap ransomware attacks. So you get hit by ransomware, you do whatever you do with that ransomware, and then within 3 months you're hit again. So if you don't find that patient zero and clean up, you're going to get hit again and again. Oh, and one more thing, just because I wasn't depressing enough, something that I was reading yesterday evening on the way here that you might want to know about, which appears to be an emerging tactic, a new emerging tactic of ransomware groups for you to consider. ALF-V, or Black Cat, very prolific ransomware as a service threat actor. It emerged yesterday that they have begun filing SEC reports about their victims if their victims don't disclose the ransomware attack. So they're always looking for new levers to get you to pay. This is the new one. Don't think in future that you can get away with not reporting, because you can't. Thank you for listening.